Americans seem to know little about John of England except that he was the bad guy in the Robin Hood legend. But contrary to what you might have seen in the movies, not only did his brother Richard not exile John from England, he in fact named him as his heir. And within 5 years, John was King of England. But during his reign, he faced a significant challenge to his authority, which resulted in a siege that not only included some of the most powerful siege engines of the day, but also the ancient practice of tunnel warfare, assisted by 40 fat pigs. The 1215 siege of Rochester Castle deserves to be remembered.
Anyone who has visited a medieval castle has to have wondered at the difficulty of trying to attack these massive structures and their mighty stone walls. One of the most notable sieges of the medieval period was the 1215 Great Siege of Rochester Castle. The siege is notable because the events were recorded, although with many gaps, by multiple chroniclers, and the method to finally breach the castle walls was, well, dramatic. But maybe more, the siege of Rochester Castle is a good example of the methods and limitations of siege technology prior to the age of gunpowder. The siege occurred as part of the First Barons' War. While there were many causes of the war was a civil war between King John, the same King John from the Robin Hood legends, and several major landholders. Crowned in 1199, John, the son of Henry II and brother of Richard I, had inherited the Angevin Empire, an empire that between the 12th and 13th centuries ruled not just England, but much of Ireland and France. The last of the Angevin kings, John had a difficult personality and a tendency to alienate fellow nobles, a trait that had contributed to his loss to Philip of France of most of the French parts of the empire. The cost of the loss, as well as his failed attempts to reclaim the lands, had fallen on English landholders, and with many complaints, several of those landholders moved into open rebellion. Initially, the dispute was resolved by a treaty called the Great Charter, signed along the banks of the River Thames on June 10, 1215, and today popularly known as the Magna Carta. While today considered a foundation of the English constitutional system, the Charter, which offered protections to the church and barons in exchange for fealty to the king, was initially a failure, with neither side abiding by its terms. Pope Innocent III, encouraged by a promise from John to engage in a crusade in the Holy Land, declared the charter illegal and unjust, and excommunicated the rebel barons and several clerics who had supported them. Open warfare broke out between the king and his supporters and the rebel barons by the end of summer.
The First Barons' War would eventually turn into a dynastic war over the throne of England, with the barons throwing the support behind Louis, the heir to the throne of France, who was married to Henry II's granddaughter. The Barons' War would include sieges of many important castles, but none nearly as dramatic as the Great Siege of Rochester Castle.
Standing along the River Medway, the strategic importance of the location of Rochester Castle was recognized early, and a battle was fought at the crossing of the Medway between the Romans and the Cantiaci tribe during the Claudian invasion in 42 A.D. It was the site of a Roman fortification or walled city built as early as the 3rd century along a Roman road between East Kent and London. According to the British National Archives, after their conquest in 1066, the Normans constructed castles all over the country in order to control their newly won territory and to pacify the Anglo-Saxon population. The original castles were timber and earth structures called a motte and bailey, and one of the first constructed was at Rochester and is listed in the 1086 Domesday Book. The castle was taken by siege by William's heir, William II, from his uncle Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, in 1088. It had been assumed that the original castle was on an outcrop called Bowley Hill, near the still-standing stone castle, but more recent archaeology has ruled out that site, and it's now generally asserted that the original castle was at the same location as the existing castle. According to English Heritage, William II asked Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, to strengthen the site with a stone fortification, described as one of the earliest such buildings in England. The castle consisted of a curtain wall some 22 feet high and 4.5 feet thick at the base, with a tower on its eastern side. Sections of that original wall have been reconstructed and can be viewed today. The fortification was surrounded by a ditch, a significant obstacle to anyone trying to attack the walls. Gundulf was skilled at overseeing construction and is considered to have been England's first chief engineer and the father of the Royal Corps of Engineers. In addition to Rochester, Gundulf also oversaw the construction of the White Tower, the central keep of the Tower of London, as well as Colchester Castle. The castle sat next to the Rochester Cathedral, and the two together would have dominated the landscape around them. In 1127, under King Henry I, William de Courbet, Archbishop of Canterbury, was given responsibility for the castle. For much of its time, the upkeep of Rochester Castle was the responsibility of the archbishop, and it was under Courbet that the great keep was constructed. Built inside the southern corner of Godolph's curtain wall, it was an extraordinary fortification. At 125 feet, it is the tallest keep in all of England, and among the tallest in Western Europe. Built largely of Kentish ragstone, faced with limestone imported from Normandy, the keep is 70 foot by 70 foot square, with towers on each corner. The walls were built to resist stone missiles and are 12 feet thick at the base, tapering to 10 feet at the top. While most Norman keeps included a basement and 2 floors, Rochester Castle included an additional floor, and the walls rise to 113 feet, with the corner towers rising an additional 12 feet. Notably, the keep was divided by what the World History Encyclopedia describes as a massive internal cross wall. Thus, even if the gate or one tower was breached, defenders could seal off and defend the other half of the castle. In building the massive keep that was contemporarily described as outstanding and noble, de Courbet spent the princely sum of £100. Realizing the strategic importance of the castle, World History Encyclopedia notes that John himself spent £115 to upgrade the castle in 1206. In June 1215, Stephen Langton was the Archbishop of Canterbury and responsible for the castle. Sometime, the chronicler Anonymous of Bethune suggests around the 20th of September, the rebels took the castle. The exact circumstances of how are unclear. John later complained that Langdon was a traitor for not handing the castle over to his supporters, but it's unclear whether Langdon, who had fled to the continent, had actively supported handing the castle over to the rebels. Chroniclers wrote that the castle's constable, Reginald de Cornhill, had taken the rebels' side and handed the castle over. While chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall says that the castle was handed over to Robert Fitzwater, one of the leaders of the barons, by the time that John arrived, the command of the castle had been handed over to William d'Albini, a large landholder who held the titles of High Sheriff of Warwickshire, Leicester, Bedfordshire, and Buckinghamshire. D'Albini had come late to the barons' cause after they had succeeded in taking London. While the exact numbers are uncertain, the rebels included from 60 to as many as 140 knights and retainers, in addition to an unknown number of crossbowmen. It was a substantial garrison of well-led and competent troops. At the time, John was at Dover, gathering an army comprised mostly of mercenaries from the continent. It is telling, in terms of his relationship with the nobility of England, that Dr. Peter Purton, an expert on medieval fortifications, notes that apart from his household knights, and not even all of them, John could not, or did not, rely on the loyalty of knights from his English lands. The importance of the position of Rochester was obvious. The rebels were in London, the king in Dover, and Rochester was between the two.
If taken by John, Rochester Castle would threaten the rebels' base in the capital and secure his control of Kent, whereas if the rebels held the castle, it would not only defend their base, but also threaten John's control over Kent.
John took his royal army to besiege the castle. By the time they arrived in mid-October, the royal army numbered likely in the thousands. Arriving on October 11th, it appears that there was no attempt to defend the city. There's no clear record as to why, but some historians have suggested that the defenders were surprised by the arrival of the royal army. In any case, taking the city made a substantial difference for the besiegers, because they were able to use the city as a base and as a shelter, as well as to forage for supplies. There, the size of the king's army could have been a disadvantage, as besiegers were as subject to hunger as those besieged. The army even housed horses in the cathedral, to its detriment. The chronicle of Ralph de Coggeshall, sympathetic to the rebels, said of the occupation, "The drinking and whoring amongst the royalist force were the subject of grave scandal, carried out only a few paces from the cathedral's high altar and the shrines of St. Paulinus and St. Ithamar. The besiegers were also able to destroy the timber causeway of the Rochester Bridge, making it much more difficult for the defenders to be reinforced from London. The king's army was substantial in size, included many experienced captains. Many of their names are still listed on a still surviving muster roll. While the baron's capture of London had cut the king off from his royal treasury, he was still adequately funded. Among the royal army's resources, chroniclers note 5 great siege engines. Purton notes that the army's payroll included siege engineers. These were not counterweight trebuchets, which had not yet arrived in England, but mangonels, powered by men pulling on cords attached to a lever and sling. Invented in China as early as the 5th century BC, they were commonly used in Europe into the 13th century, when they were largely replaced by counterweight trebuchet, although they continued to be used as they were lighter and more portable. Still, the mangonels represented a fact of siege warfare prior to the age of gunpowder. In general, walls were stronger than the machines used to attack them. The stones thrown by the mangonels could only throw weights up to about 50 pounds, and notably did little damage to the walls. Rather, they were a threat to the defenders, making it deadly to defend the castle's walls. Perton notes, however, that the stones could eventually cause damage to the wall's crenellations, thus making defending the wall more dangerous. Possibly more important was the psychological effect on the defenders, especially as the king's army was large enough to work in shifts and continue the bombardment with both the siege engines and crossbows, day and night. Still, Perton points out that John and his engineers would have been aware that the bombardment alone could not be expected to breach even the curtain wall, and would do little damage to the thick-walled keep. The barons made an attempt with some 700 knights to march from London to raise the siege on October 26, but the attempt was abandoned for unknown reasons. In any case, the river would have been an obstacle with the bridge disabled, but the attempt did mean that John knew that time would be limited, as there was both a risk of attack by the barons and of an attempt to invade by Louis.
One chronicler wrote that lack of supplies forced the defenders to expel from the castle everyone who could not participate in its defense. The anonymously written Barnwell Chronicle says that John punished those expelled by cutting off their hands and feet.
Exactly how the curtain wall was breached is unclear. While the chronicles say that the walls were breached by miners, and there is record both of paying miners and requesting mining equipment such as picks, Perton notes the obvious issue that to do so, the miners would have had to cross the ditch. Although it's unknown exactly how large the protective ditch was at the time, filling the ditch to allow the miners to access the walls while under fire would have been a slow and deadly task, and Perton speculates that this is what occupied the attackers for the first 40 days of the siege. Between the bombardment and reaching the walls, chroniclers suggested that the king's army took significant casualties. While tunnel warfare implies a mine that is fully underground, that was actually uncommon, and in the case of the Rochester castle, unlikely given the ditch. Rather, John's miners likely simply dug a trench under parts of the walls, causing them to collapse, although archaeology on the site has been unable to determine exactly where. While some chronicles assert that the breaches resulted in significant hand-to-hand fighting, they list few casualties among the defenders, suggesting that they were aware of the engineers' efforts and simply retreated to the keep, which would be a significantly different challenge. The front entrance to the keep was protected by a gatehouse, behind which was a removable wooden ramp, and then another tower, protected by both strong wooden doors and a portcullis. It was a gate both designed to impress and to defend, and Perton notes, the fact that it played no role in the attack suggests that John's men preferred the risk of mining rather than trying to get in by the front door. It was the attack on the main keep, however, that led John, on November 25th, to send the famous and peculiar order to Hugh de Burgh, the Sheriff of Kent. Send to us, with all speed, by day and night, 40 of the fattest pigs, of the sort least good for eating, to bring fire beneath the tower.
No, the process did not include attacking the castle with burning pigs. Rather, the pigs were slaughtered and rendered for their highly flammable fat.
The miners undermined the tower on the southeast corner of the keep, using wooden logs as props to keep the stone from falling in on them. The pig's fat was then applied to the props, burning them quickly and causing the tower to collapse. While the general conception is that the miners would have dug a tunnel under the walls, Perton notes that this is almost certainly not the case. The keep was given a very deep foundation to prevent exactly such mining, and the foundation itself sat upon the previous Roman wall. Such an excavation would have been extremely difficult and too slow given the time frame. And moreover, it's obvious still today that the plinth under the tower is still intact. Rather, Perton argues, the attackers would have built a wooden defensive structure around the base of the tower to protect themselves from missile attacks from the defenders, and the tower would have been undermined at ground level. When the timbers were fired, the collapse of the tower took down the keep walls halfway down both sides. But the work would have been obvious, and the defenders had time to move supplies to the other side of the keep's strong cross wall. Thus, even as the tower collapsed, the defenders were able to defend the other side of the keep. But by then, supplies were running low, and the defending knights had even been forced to eat their own horses. On November 30th, the defenders surrendered. The Barnwell chronicler wrote of the siege, "No one alive can remember a siege so fiercely pressed and so manfully resisted."
Despite anger over his losses, with just one exception, John decided to spare the defenders' lives. While he might have liked to have hanged them all, that offered a particular risk, because his own troops then would have been reticent to serve, as they could have expected the same treatment had they been captured. Moreover, captives could be exchanged for ransom.
Despite the importance of the castle, the siege ended up having little effect on the larger war. Louis invaded and took the castle the following year, with no chronicle explaining how. John died of dysentery while on campaign in 1216, and with him died much of the reason for the fighting. Most of the barons shifted their support behind John's 9-year-old son Henry, and Louis was forced to give up his claim to the English throne the following year. The castle was returned to royal control in 1217 and repaired. The destroyed tower was replaced with a circular tower, so obvious today. The keep resisted a siege during another baronial uprising in 1264. Although now in a state of ruin, it remains significantly intact and is considered one of the most important surviving 12th century keeps in England and France.
The 2011 film Ironclad was loosely based on the siege of Rochester Castle, although it was largely panned for its almost completely historically inaccurate representation of the siege of Rochester Castle. The siege of Rochester Castle was the largest that had ever occurred in England to that point, and it represented really the limitations of siege warfare. Despite being outnumbered between 10 and 20 to 1, the defenders of Rochester Castle held out for nearly 2 months, caused significant casualties among the attackers, and in the end, despite the effort of 40 fat pigs, it was starvation and not the attacks on the castle that forced the castle's surrender. Still, after the siege, the Barnwell chronicler writes, there were few who would put their faith in castles. When you think of the Crusades, it tends to conjure up images of the Holy Land, of battles in the desert, and the long fight for the control of Jerusalem. But in fact, many of the most successful Crusades occurred much closer to Christendom, in Europe. In what is today Poland and Germany, the Teutonic Order of Knights sought to Christianize and colonize the old Prussians and other people living along the coasts of the Baltic Sea. And to consolidate their power, they built fortresses that they could use as bases to keep the local population submissive. One of the most impressive of those fortifications was Malbork Castle, which is in modern-day Malbork, Poland, not too far from Gdansk. It is considered to be the largest castle in the world by land area, and it was the center of the region for hundreds of years. The history of Malbork Castle deserves to be remembered. The region east of the Vistula River and reaching into modern Lithuania was in the 10th century home to a variety of tribes referred to as Old Prussians, among others, who primarily believed in a kind of paganism. Beginning in the 10th century, local Polish kings fought with the tribes there, seeking to expand their land and convert the populace. For most of 200 years, the various kings failed to make much progress, and in the 13th century the Prussians counterattacked and sacked hundreds of churches and cathedrals. The action drew the attention of Pope Honorius III. Honorius sent a papal bull to a bishop, Christian of Oliva, to initiate and preach a crusade against the Prussians, but the initial crusade in 1222 was largely ineffective. In 1226, Hermann von Salza, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, was invited to assist the crusade. The Teutonic Order, officially the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, was originally formed in 1190 in the Holy Land in the city of Acre. They were formed to protect pilgrims in their journeys to the Levant, as well as establish hospitals. They also controlled the portals of Acre. In 1211, the order moved to Bohemia, where the King of Hungary had requested their help to secure the border. This lasted until 1225, when they were expelled for trying to form their own state in the area. Salza was therefore interested in establishing a state for his order, and would only assist in the crusade against the Prussians if he had some promise of unhindered control of the region. A series of documents would accomplish this goal. First, the Golden Bull of Rimini, a decree by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, issued supposedly in 1226, which conferred the right of conquest in the region to the order. Modern historical studies suggest that this bull may be backdated and was actually issued in 1235. A 1230 treaty between the order and the Polish Duke of Masovia transferred some of the duke's land to the order, although the document itself does not survive. Finally, a papal bull in 1234 confirmed the order's land in conquest to eternal and absolute ownership. Thus, in 1230, Salza and the Teutonic Order initiated the Prussian Crusade. They quickly turned both the land granted to them by the Polish Duke and conquered lands into the state of the Teutonic Order. Over the following decades, the order conquered Prussia and extended further along the coast into the modern Baltic states. In 1260, with much of Europe and the order busy with fighting in the Holy Land, the Great Prussian Uprising occurred, leading to the destruction of most of the order's castles, and a long but ultimately successful fight to suppress the revolt. The order eventually killed all of the opposing war leaders and killed locals en masse if they refused to convert to Christianity. The revolt was firmly crushed by 1274. Sometime in the late 13th century, the order began the construction of Malbork Castle, hoping to use it to consolidate control of the region in the aftermath of the uprising. The Polish name Malbork and the German name Marienburg were both taken from the Virgin Mary. No documents survive regarding its initial construction, but it began as a small red brick fort that acted as a local command post. Its fortifications were gradually enlarged, with the first stage of construction ending around the year 1300. Simultaneously, a town grew around the castle. The initial phase involved the construction of what is now known as the Upper Castle, a fully contained monastic and defensive structure. The order always had a dual purpose to its fortifications, which were both defensive and religious. After 1300, the order conquered more land, including parts of Pomerania and the city of Gdansk. Shortly after, the order moved its administrative center to Marienburg, and the Grand Master moved from Venice to the castle in 1308. By this time, the Teutonic state stretched from Gdansk in the west around the coast of the Baltic Sea to control large parts of modern Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The new Grand Master began a project to enlarge the castle. The Middle Castle was built at this time, along with the Knight's Hall, flanked with lodging fit for the Grand Master himself. The original modest church was enlarged, and the Upper Castle further strengthened. The castle was built entirely of bricks and in a Gothic style, although brick Gothic structures lacked the sculpture of other Gothic architecture. The use of brick to build these large structures, especially in northern Europe and along the Baltic Sea, was dictated by local geography. The region had little in the way of standing stone to use for construction, and before the use of brick, largely relied on timber and wood, which proved to be generally unsuitable for the sheer size of some of the brick Gothic structures. Standing near the Nogat River and the Vistula Delta, plentiful clay from the region could be brought to make the bricks. Malbork is the largest medieval brick Gothic complex in Europe. The second phase of construction continued to enlarge the complex, and the first bridge across the Nogat was built nearby. A third phase involved the expansion of the Grand Master's residence into a proper palace and the construction of the lower castle. The castle itself is rectangular in the style of the order, and at its height houses as many as 3,000 knights. It was the administrative capital and headquarters of the Teutonic state, and when construction was completed in 1406, the largest Gothic fortification in Europe. The entire complex covers 52 acres, large enough to give it a disputed claim to the world's largest castle by land area. Construction was essentially completed by 1406, and the castle stood largely as it does today. This coincided with the greatest power and extent of the Teutonic state, which continued to fight against pagan Lithuanians and Russians in the region. Throughout the 14th century, in addition to fighting pagans as a part of their crusade, the knights had fought with Poland. Polish leaders had been at odds with the order since the beginning, as the Polish duke seemed to believe that the land the Teutonic state conquered would become his. In 1308, the order had conquered Gdansk, then a Polish city, at the request of the Poles and as an ally against Brandenburg. But instead, the Teutons attacked the city, defeated the Brandenburgians and the Poles both, and took control of the whole town, thereby killing everyone who defied their will. The order was accused of a massacre of as many as 10,000 people in the city, although later studies suggest that the number was likely much lower, perhaps the still large number of 1,000. This action led to wars between Poland and the Teutonic state, and lawsuits in the papal court that found in favor of the Poles, though the Teutons would not give back the land to the Polish. In 1385, the Teutons' aggression against both Poland and Lithuania led to the personal union of the two states, wherein the Duke of the Duchy of Lithuania married the Queen of Poland and became the leader of both states. The king also converted to Christianity and pledged to convert his lands, which officially ended the Teutonic crusade against them as non-Christians, but did not end the conflict between the two powers. The Teutons invaded Poland in 1409, instigating the Polish-Lithuanian Teutonic War. The Teutons were at the height of military power and prestige, but were defeated soundly at the Battle of Grunwald, which effectively broke the state's military power. Most of the order's leadership was killed, including the Grand Master. The order was on the verge of collapse when the Polish-Lithuanian army arrived at Marienburg and Malbork Castle in July of 1410. The castle was then defended by Heinrich von Plauen, who had not been at Grunwald, but took a force of 3,000 men to defend Malbork as the capital of the order. It isn't clear if this was on his own initiative or if he had orders to do so. The Polish-Lithuanian forces had not expected much resistance, believing apparently that the defeat at Grunwald had effectively destroyed the order and that Prussia was already conquered. After arriving on July 26th, they sent forces to capture other castles that were left without a garrison, but allowed von Plauen to communicate with allies, which led to reinforcements and loans to pay mercenaries. Von Plauen also had the town surrounding the castle burned to deny the enemy its shelter. While the army was held at Marienburg, forces were raised elsewhere to oust the invading army. The besiegers were unprepared for a long siege, hadn't brought sufficient ammunition, and quickly suffered from an epidemic of dysentery. By September, the Polish-Lithuanian forces lifted the siege, in the face of reinforcements and low morale. Von Plauen became a hero and savior of the order, and recaptured most of the castles in Prussia before negotiating the Peace of Thorn, which allowed the Teutons to keep most of their territory. The order, however, was saddled with large debts, and over the next decades earned the enmity of much of the Prussian population for their rule. Prussian nobles in particular saw that Polish nobles enjoyed more control over the government and greater privileges. The Prussians found an ally in King Casimir IV of Poland, and in 1454 Prussian nobles asked Casimir to bring Prussia to the Polish kingdom. The Prussians initiated a rebellion and immediately captured most of the country, notably leaving Marienburg in Teutonic hands. The castle was again besieged, this time by a better prepared foe, but the siege was thrown into complete disorder when the knights won a stunning victory at Konitz. The siege was thrown off, but the war was not yet won, and the Polish forces returned within the year. The order could no longer afford to pay its own mercenaries, was totally dependent on assistance from the Holy Roman Empire. Malbork Castle was largely defended by mercenaries in 1457 when a Polish general raised funds and bribed the unpaid mercenaries to abandon the castle's defenses. Casimir was able to enter the great castle without serious resistance. Fighting continued until 1466, when the Second Peace of Thorn, which ended the 13 Years' War. The order retained only part of its land, and not Marienburg, but were made a fief and protectorate of the Polish kingdom. The castle itself, however, was still an impressive palace, and for the next 300 years served as a residence of the kings of Poland, who stayed there often. The castle also housed the Polish Admiralty and became the site of a Polish mint and a large arsenal. It was twice occupied by Swedish forces in the 30 Years' War and visited by Swedish kings. It was damaged at this time by fire, and some other outer defenses were demolished. In 1772, the castle was annexed by the Kingdom of Prussia, but by then the castle was somewhat neglected. It was rediscovered by Prussia following a survey meant to determine if the castle should be demolished, leading it to becoming a central symbol of Prussian history and a connection to the Germanic Teutonic Knights. In 1804, it was identified as historically important castle by the Prussian king, and restoration began in 1817. The 1910 German Naval School at Flensburg was established by Kaiser Wilhelm, and the school was built to reflect the brick Gothic style of Malbork Castle. During the rise of the Third Reich, the Nazis used the castle as part of their mythic history of Germany, and it was a pilgrimage site for the Hitler Youth. And the castle served as an inspiration for the Nazi order castle schools. During the war, the castle was severely damaged by fighting and the explosion of an ammunition dump located within the fortress. As much as half of the fortress lay in ruins after the war. Since World War II, Poland has continued reconstruction work on the castle. The Castle Museum was opened in 1965 and restoration is ongoing. It was declared one of Poland's historic monuments in 1994 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. Malbork Castle is still standing today, a magnificent example of Gothic brick architecture that is full of history from its founding in the 13th century all the way through its role in the Second World War. In the medieval period, the castle never fell by force, a testament to the strength of the castle as a fortification, and it is today one of the, if not the largest castles in the world. Represents a unique part of European history when Europeans were colonizing other parts of Europe. And the Teutons, though less famous than the Templars, played perhaps an even larger role in European history. Let's be honest, most Americans' vision of a medieval castle is based on the ones that we see in Disney parks. But to be fair, those were based on real castles, particularly Neuschwanstein, or the New Swan Stone Castle, built on a rugged hill in Bavaria. But Neuschwanstein is anything but medieval. It was commissioned in 1869 by the Bavarian king Ludwig II, who was obsessed with fairy tales. Today he's sometimes called the Swan King or the Fairy Tale King, but he's mostly known as the Mad King. Ludwig II led a troubled life. He died in mysterious circumstances, and yet he left behind a legacy in music and in stone that has become almost synonymous with Bavaria. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On August 25th, 1845, the future king was born to Maximilian, Crown Prince of Bavaria, and Marie of Prussia. His parents intended to name him Otto, but his grandfather, King Ludwig I, insisted the name be changed. Otto was born on the king's own birthday, or probably the day before, with the date changed purely for appearances, which was also the feast day of the patron saint of Bavaria, King Louis IX. So he was renamed Ludwig, the German version of Louis, and his younger brother would become Otto. Ludwig had an odd childhood and was described by some as an odd boy. When he was 3, his grandfather abdicated the throne in the face of forces of the German revolutions of 1848 and a personal scandal over an indiscreet relationship with an Irish dancer called Lola Montez. Maximilian became king of Bavaria and restored stability to the regime, but paid little personal attention to his son. When Maximilian's advisors suggested the king take Ludwig with him on walks, the king answered, "But what am I to say to him?" Of his mother, one cabinet member said that Marie scarcely even knew how to treat her children as children ought to be treated. As an adult, Ludwig referred to his own mother as my predecessor's consort, and his youth as a series of humiliating torments. Ludwig spent most of his childhood at his father's castle, whose walls were decorated with myths and fairy tales like the Arthurian Parsifal and Lohengrin, the Knight of the Swan, which sparked his obsession with all things fairy tale. From a young age, Ludwig did not enjoy playing soldier or hunting, activities his parents thought appropriate for a crown prince, but was an imaginative boy and preferred stories and solitude. When asked if he was bored, the young prince replied, "I imagine various things and keep myself quite amused." His father scolded him while his brother was more spoiled, and it affected his psyche. "Otto is a good boy, and I will be good also," he wrote to his mother. His behavior was sometimes abhorrent. He stole a purse and argued that all that belongs to my subjects belongs to me, and nearly strangled his brother with a rope for daring to resist his will. He learned young about the divine right of kings and the superiority of his house. He also showed some early tendencies towards hallucinations, perhaps a byproduct of inbreeding in the royal family. When he was 12, he heard about Richard Wagner's opera Lohengrin, about a mythical German hero, and begged to see it. His parents refused. While famous, Wagner was a controversial figure for his scorn of religion and politics. Ludwig finally saw the play 2 years later, and it changed his life. He was enthralled by the music and by watching his childhood fantasies come to life. A year later, he saw another of Wagner's operas, Tannhauser. The secretary who attended with the prince said that Ludwig was thrown in such convulsions that I was afraid he might have an epileptic seizure. Ludwig's childhood came to a halt when his father died suddenly on March 10, 1864. Heralds rode through Munich in a snowstorm, trumpeting the news. The 18-year-old prince was now King Ludwig II of Bavaria. At Maximilian's funeral, a Bavarian writer wrote glowingly of the dark-haired, handsome prince. "He was the most beautiful youth I had ever seen." The king was less enthusiastic, writing, "It has been my fate to be called too young to face heavy responsibilities, too heavy for young shoulders, too difficult for a young brain." Ludwig was a very solitary person, but he did have a close friend in his cousin Elizabeth, who was Empress of Austria by marriage. They became close after his coronation. "I think those that are taken to be insane are the only really intelligent people," she wrote to Ludwig. After becoming king, he contacted his greatest obsession, Richard Wagner. Wagner struggled his whole life to pay creditors, and when Ludwig wrote him, the artist was on the run. "Some friend must arise to help me," Wagner wrote. "Only a miracle could help me now, and that right soon, or I am done for." Ludwig's letter must have been a miracle too. It included a ruby ring and the note, "As the stone burns, so do I burn with ardor to behold the creator of the words and music of Lohengrin." When they met, Ludwig was completely enthralled. "I have no other disciple who is so utterly my own. It is scarcely believable," Wagner wrote. The king rented a house for the composer and pressed him to do nothing but write. Ludwig peppered him with letters, writing, "My love for you and your art grows even greater, and this flame of love shall bring you happiness and salvation." His love for Wagner was not shared by the Bavarian public. They thought the king was lavishing too much attention on his friend. When the prime minister threatened to resign if Wagner didn't leave, Ludwig was forced to exile the composer, hoping he would be able to return someday. In 1866, outside political events intruded. At the time, Germany did not exist as a country, but was made up of dozens of small states. The most powerful was Prussia, which hoped to unite Germany under its leadership. Prussia's competitor for German hegemony was Austria and southern German states like Bavaria. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, forced the issue by declaring war in the summer of '66. Ludwig, who wanted the title of king but not the duties, tried to give up his throne rather than take a position, until Wagner, for purely selfish reasons, convinced him to keep his crown. He chose to support Austria. Ludwig did his best to forget about the war, refusing to lead the army or even to receive news from Parliament. The Austrian ambassador wrote, "One begins to think that the king is demented." When finally forced to visit the army, he was traumatized by the wounded. The 7 Weeks' War was brief, but a resounding defeat for Austria and Bavaria. Austria was kicked out of the German Union, and Bavaria was forced to acknowledge Prussian supremacy. Among the kingly duties in which Ludwig had no interest was marriage. The state was pushing him to find a wife, and even Wagner tried to convince him of it. "I haven't time to get married," he said. He was eventually worn down, however, and began to pay attention to Empress Elizabeth's younger sister, Sophia. She shared an appreciation for Wagner. They were engaged, but Ludwig acted oddly with Sophia, and his obsession with Wagner shone through. In letters, he used the names of characters from Wagner's operas instead of their own. He left an official engagement ball without warning to go to the theater. When together, he made her play and sing music from the operas. He soured on the wedding quickly. He told an advisor that he'd rather drown than marry. He postponed the wedding several times, and when Sophia's father demanded that he set a firm date or cancel the wedding, Ludwig happily took the offered way out. Sophia got rid of. The gloomy picture fades. I long for freedom, to awake from this terrible nightmare, he wrote in his journal. Sophia's reputation suffered from rumors after the broken engagement, though she was at the time in love with another man. In fact, from Ludwig's personal writings, it seems that he was much more attracted to men, although he struggled with the urges and his religion. Ludwig's myriad disappointments drove him to find an escape. How necessary it is to create for oneself such poetic places of refuge, where one can forget for a while the dreadful times in which I live. He decorated his room with stars and a fountain, and created a winter garden indoors in Munich, complete with a waterfall and an artificial moon. When his grandfather died, the former king's pension came to him, giving him funds to be more ambitious. He chose a beautiful location within inside of his childhood palace to build himself a castle. It experienced ruins there as a child and resolved to build Neuschwanstein atop the rugged peaks. He hired a stage designer to lead the construction and decorated the walls with murals of his favorite stories. Ludwig oversaw every detail of the building, spared no expense. The throne room, which never received an actual throne, had 2 million painstakingly arranged tiles. He built the castle in honor of Wagner and based much of it on his stage productions. War broke out again in 1870, this time between Prussia and France. Ludwig was bound to support Prussia, but again found himself terribly stressed by the possibility of a war. Prussia's victory cemented Prussian power and allowed Bismarck to bring the last German states into his German Confederation. An emperor was to be named, and Ludwig hoped it could be him. A futile hope, since Bismarck never meant to empower Bavaria. Wilhelm, Ludwig's uncle and the King of Prussia, was the chosen leader. Ludwig was so upset he refused to attend the negotiations. Bavaria did gain privileged status within the German Empire, and Ludwig reluctantly supported unification with Wilhelm as emperor. The Second Reich was born. He dove further into personal projects. He loved the palace at Versailles and the opulence of King Louis XIV, the Sun King. He built Linderhof Palace, the only construction he lived to see completed. He demanded absolute control over construction, reflecting his desire to be an autocrat. His room in the palace was decorated with gold and had a 1,000-pound crystal chandelier. Also at Linderhof was his table that sets itself. The king liked to dine alone, and the table could be lowered into the kitchen, filled with food, and then raised so that he didn't have to deal with servants. One of his most ambitious constructs was the Venus Grotto, again inspired by Wagner. It was an enormous man-made cave made to look natural, with a waterfall and a large lake. Included one of Bavaria's first electrical generator-powered lights and a wave machine. The king seemed to be growing more eccentric as he aged. He gained weight, and his love of sweets rotted out most of his teeth, causing constant pain. He cultivated a peculiar walk, meant to imitate Louis XIV, which one observer called a total mockery of nature. He began sleeping during the day and riding his horses at night. He surprised peasants in their homes after midnight and lavished them with gifts. He staged hundreds of plays and operas, mostly by Wagner, for himself alone. He began 2 more palaces and planned an even greater castle. He paid for a large theater in Bayreuth, called the Festival Theater for Wagner, where the composer first showed his 4-opera Ring cycle in 1876. When Wagner died, Ludwig ordered all of his pianos be draped with black. He regularly set his table for 3 or 4, though he dined alone, so he could imagine and converse with people such as Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. He was difficult to his servants, whom he would berate, forbid from looking at him, and forced to bow to him as they backed out of the room. He usually communicated in notes, as he wished not to speak. Ludwig's projects were financed entirely from his own money, but by 1884 he had spent everything he had and borrowed some 8 million marks. He made plans for even more palaces despite his financial troubles, but his workers halted construction because they weren't being paid. His cabinet officials were furious. He sent servants as far as Persia to ask for loans and tried to get them to rob a bank. As criticism grew, he turned inward even more, finally refusing to go to the capital and only communicating via letter. Johann Lutz, prime minister, decided to take the king down. He met with the king's uncle, Luitpold, who agreed to become regent if Ludwig could be proven insane. Lutz turned to Dr. Bernard von Guden, who listened to reports from servants, many of whom were paid for their wild reports, and declared that the king suffered from paranoia. Guden said the king was incurably insane and had to be removed from power. He never examined the king directly. The cabinet appointed a commission to arrest the king at Neuschwanstein on June 7, 1886. They planned to confine him at Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. The king caught wind of the plan before the commission could arrive and barricaded himself inside the castle with help from local peasants and soldiers. Luitpold was declared regent and Ludwig remained paralyzed with indecision, talking of suicide. When the commissioners came again, the king had been abandoned by his servants and was captured without a fight. "How can you certify me insane without seeing me?" he demanded of Gudin, who insisted that the servant's testimony was enough. The king appeared calm the next day and collected. His cousin Elizabeth was across the lake, and the water was covered in boats, some of which carried peasants who supported him. That afternoon he insisted on going for a walk during a rainstorm, and Gudin accompanied him, alone. The doctor had a train to catch at 8 p.m., but when the hour arrived, neither of the men had returned. The rain had grown heavier. By 10 p.m., searchers discovered hats and coats soaked and abandoned by the lake. They took a boat out and found both men dead. Gudin showed signs of a fight. His face was scratched, a fingernail had been torn off, and he had a gash in his forehead. The king was simply still, face down, in the water. So ended the reign of the fairy tale king. The exact circumstances of what happened that night have never become clear. A letter that he wrote to his cousin Elizabeth across the lake that night has been lost. The official government explanation was that Ludwig had attacked Gudin and then killed himself. There were armed peasants on the lake in boats, so perhaps it was an attempted escape that failed. Years later, rumors started to arrive that Ludwig had been assassinated. There were rumors that the cloak that they'd found on the shore had bullet holes in it, and that the doctor that had examined Ludwig's body had been forced to lie about bullet wounds, even though it's not really clear what anyone had to gain from assassinating Ludwig at that point, and in any case we'll never know. The cloak was burned in a fire, and the king's body has never been exhumed. It's not even clear that Ludwig was actually mad. Doctors today, looking at his behavior, disagree. Some say that his behavior really showed that he was merely an eccentric, although others say there was evidence of frontal lobe injury and that he showed some signs of personality disorder. Just 7 weeks after his death, his buildings were made open to tourists, and of course since have earned Bavaria many millions more than they ever cost to build. His legacy in those buildings and in the later works of Wagner, which never would have been composed were it not for Ludwig's patronage, far outlast him and have come to be seen as synonymous with Bavaria itself. In an irony, the German magazine Focus noted in 2014 that he won the love of his subjects only posthumously. But what to make of the fairy tale king? Well, perhaps from that we should take his own word. He once wrote, "I intend to remain an enigma to myself and others." And so he has. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.